Leviticus chapters 2 and 3. I hope you're pleasantly surprised to find that the book of Leviticus isn't quite as boring and that we have more in common, and it's actually more important than perhaps we thought of. It's definitely a book often overlooked, especially in Christianity. Um, I don't know very many people that can say they've read the book of Leviticus. And we're going to move on, but we're still trying to do our best to get to where we can understand the Bible as far as it is translated correctly. Leviticus chapter 2 is the mincha sacrifice, which is a grain offering. Now, Nehemiah Gordon says that many English translations ironically translate that as a meat offering. And that's just Old English. In Old English, meat meant grain, but correctly, it is not a meat offering. It's actually a grain offering. It's usually fine flour. Verse 1, with the help of our LDS scholar Jared Halverson, he says, he shifts to grain offerings in chapter 2, though they're called meat offerings here. When any will offer a meat offering unto Yehovah, other translations, he says, say a grain offering, and that's more true to what's happening. So we have two scholars that agree. And, without that information, I would assume this is another meat offering. So great insight. Just that alone has value. The verse ends with, his offering shall be of fine flour. And then Halverson says, now remember in Alma 34:14, every whit pointing. Keep your symbolism glasses on. What's fine flour? Oh, this is good wheat. It's not tares. It's not chaff. And the verse says, and it's finely ground down. He shall pour oil upon it. And what's this oil? There's Gethsemane. There's the olive press. In fact, if you didn't know it, the site of the temple in Jerusalem, the temple site originally was a press. It was a millstone. That's where they ground and made flour. So this is really powerful symbolism. So there's the olive press. That's what we're referring to. The verse ends with, and put frankincense thereon. Oh, there's one of the things they put into the incense altar as part of the prayer of the saints. Verse 2, and he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priest, and shall take thereout his handful of the flour thereof, and the oil thereof, and with the frankincense thereof, and the priest shall burn the memorial of it upon the altar to be an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. Actually, you can see Papa John has restored the name unto Yehovah. Verse 3, and the remnant, Halverson says, of the meat offering shall be Aaron's and his sons. It is a thing most holy of the offerings of the Lord made by fire, of the offerings of Yehovah made by fire. So you understand the difference. They're offering flour and oil and frankincense, and they're giving it to God. Now they're giving it to the priest to give to God, and the priest will take a handful of the flour and the oil and take all of these frankincense and put all of those onto the altar. This is the token offering to God. It all belongs to him, but he is willing to give us a portion. In fact, he's willing to give us the greater portion. He's only asking for a handful of all that's been given. Might as well give him all the frankincense since you can't eat that ourselves. There's that sweet savor to God ascending smoke to heaven. And what's left of the sacrifice? The remainder of the flour and oil is what the priest will be able to eat. Halverson continues, now we need to be omnivorous, not strictly carnivorous. carnivorous. So if we're only eating burnt sacrifices, well, even if I kind of get tired of barbecue after time, and the priest will consume part of the offerings of meat, Not the burnt offerings, that's all to God. But these other offerings, the priest is allowed to eat part of the meat, and here they will also partake of the grain. It allows the priest to have a well-balanced diet like everyone else gets. Everyone else, since the priests don't have a land of their own to grow their own crops, they're here to serve everyone else in the spiritual vein. I'll help you spiritually, you can help me temporally, and everything's being consecrated. So that's what's happening. There's an obvious spiritual purpose first and foremost. All things are spiritual unto me, including the temporal, says the Lord in Doctrine and Covenants 29:34-5. The priority is the spiritual purpose, but yes, there's a practical purpose, and that's to feed the priest. Now, some of these grains offerings are going to be cakes. Some are wafers, some are baked on griddles, some are in frying pans. He describes all of them here in Leviticus chapter 2. But the common denominator, the rule of all of them have to follow, and that's in verse 11. Is this a surprise to you? I know growing up, I didn't realize that you could eat the offering, whether it was meat or grain. I didn't realize it was a barbecue in a sense at times. But I love the insight that this is how the priests survive because they don't even have a land inheritance. Um, they're totally dependent upon the other tribes who do have a land inheritance, and their whole role is focused on the temple service. Well, eventually the temple. Right now, it's still the tabernacle. Kind of cool stuff to think about. And as these verses I kind of skip, you'll see where I've crossed out meat and put grain uh, because it makes more sense in our modern English to realize that's not a meat, that's a grain offering. You'll notice the turquoise blue at the restoration of the divine name with the all four consonants, the yod, the hey, the vav, and the hey, and even the vowel markers, the holam, kamatz, and the shavah. Those are the little dots and dashes on the top and bottom of some of those consonants. Now, our LDS scholar continues, no meat offerings, verse 11, which ye shall bring unto Yahweh shall be made with leaven. So you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey in any offering of Yahweh made by fire. And then he adds, and remember, leaven, as we saw with the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, can represent sin because that yeast leads to mold and decay of the bread. So we've got to eliminate it. If you're going to give something to God, make sure that it's a worthy offering, that it reflects the worthiness you see in Him. I want to give Him my absolute best. The firstlings of the flock, the no blemish, no leaven, and even no honey. That's one I still kind of waiting for further light and knowledge on. Howerson adds, the honey. Why is the honey involved in this way? Verse 12. As for the oblation of the first fruits, ye shall offer them unto Jehovah, but they shall not be burnt on the altar for a sweet savor. And you notice the savor is spelled, well, I think that's universal. At first I was thinking that was the British way, but that's proper. Jared Halverson continues, verse 12, footnotes. I do wonder, like with most symbols, is this meant to be a negative or a positive? Just leave leaven, just like leaven could be both. If it's a negative symbol, then it could be the kind of sweet thing that we're not supposed to indulge in. If so, then in life, put sweet in quotation marks here. Okay, it's just a bitter aftertaste, that's for sure. Sin always does, so don't give that to the Lord. Yet, on the other hand, if honey is a positive symbol, since the Lord speaks of the promised land being a land flowing with milk and honey, perhaps this again is God's generosity saying, oh, you can keep all the honey for yourself. I'm okay, I don't need it. Give me your handful and keep the greater portion. Give me your tenth, and you'll have the 90% for yourself. Even though, yes, technically, it all belongs to me. And amazingly, what the Lord's trying to teach us here and what He's trying to teach all of us is, okay, and again, as we're pondering symbolism, thinking of everything you know about these substances, these symbols, think of what any time that they're brought up in Scripture and what they might represent. Allow for multiple interpretations. Again, the key to understanding symbolism is don't lock yourself down to a single thing, and certainly don't allow your thoughts of a symbol lead you in some paths that are illogical or goes against things you already know to be true. That's when you know you're doing the wrong thing and thinking of using the wrong element in the object to symbolize. Halverson adds, I've often said that symbolism is never meant to teach us something brand new. Joseph Smith actually said and taught that parables don't teach us new doctrines because it's too confusing if it's new. The Lord will always make sure he clarifies it elsewhere to make sure you get it. Okay, and that's the power of symbolism, not to teach new doctrines, but to deepen our understanding of and appreciation for existing doctrine that he has taught much more clearly elsewhere. We need a Nephi to be clear, and we need an Isaiah to infuse it with power and meaning. There are some powerful things here. Those are well said, Jared. Again, I love the way he can pull things together, almost in poetry form. Verse 13, and every oblation of thy meat offering shall thou season with salt, neither shalt thou suffer the salt of the covenant of thy Elohim to be lacking from thy meat offering. With all thine offerings thou shalt offer salt. Howerson says, now, if you just want to stick with the practical, then I'm sure the priests are grateful for that food as it being salted. But also, if you're focusing on the spiritual and the metaphorical, yes, you are the light of the world, but also, are ye the salt? Aren't you the salt of the earth? And because you're the salt of the earth, what was salt for? Yes, for flavoring, but also for preservation. See, so are we leavening the lump, or are we salting the earth? Are we giving sweet savor to God? Are we preserving our fellow men and women by crying repentance and by setting a positive example? These offerings are meant to symbolize all of that. And I've heard of that. Salt is a preservative. So the saints, the believers on earth, are helping preserve God's standard, his ways, his truths, the whole plan, the knowledge of God, and how we can return to him. We're preserving that in the earth. But too bad, and too often I've heard preachers within my people and from other Christian faiths who almost use salt as a stinging in the eyes. And yeah, we're preserving the truth, but perhaps we can do it a little more gently. And maybe sugar could come with that lump of salt, perhaps. Although I don't mind honest truth. Truth is the hardest substance in the universe. You cannot destroy truth. You can't alter it. You can't change it. But we do live in a pampered age, and I think it's in the day and age we live in, we better start with a little more kindness and instead of just absolute truth as if it's and beat us over the head with it, right? Now, Jono Vandor, our messianic believer from Australia, regarding verse 13, he reads it, and every offer of your grain offering. Now, just before that, it already said, don't be putting leaven or honey in this. There's none of that in the grain offering, but you shall season with salts. You shall not allow the salts of the covenant of God to be lacking from your grain offering. So the salt of the covenant of your God, what's that about, Nehemiah? And Nehemiah says, seems kind of straightforward to me. You add salt. This is a grain offering. This is another type of free will offering. I guess it's actually technically, you could call it a peace offering. That is something that you would eat. It's interesting that you translate it as a fellowship offering because that's really the function that it served in many respects. But then there are more rules that talk about it in other places that basically you have 3 days to eat it and then you have to burn it after this. And this offering, when you offered it, you'd bring it to the temple and sacrifice it, and then you'd go somewhere in a clean place and you would eat it as a festival meal. This was a festival meal. And whereas the Christians, what do we call it? A fellowship offering. Interesting. And then Nehemiah completes his footnote by saying, for example, at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 20, where it actually talks about Saul having one of these peace offerings and David is missing, you can read why he was ritually unclean. And so he wasn't able to come to this peace offering today. And why wasn't he? Because this is a sacrificial meat. It wasn't just regular meat. So this was something they did on special occasions. People didn't eat meat every day like we do in some countries in the world. It was a special occasion when people ate meat. And so they wanted to dedicate that in a way to Yehovah and to have it be a ritual act. So they made a peace offering. Wow. None of that information I've ever heard from any Christian source. And here we are at the end of chapter 2. How about that? Nehemiah says Leviticus 2:14-16 has to do with the biblical calendar. I could talk about that for 3 hours. And boy, if you ever hear him talking about the biblical calendar and his attempts with others to restore we don't even realize, and we'll have to just, Papa John will hold his thoughts for another episode. Chapter 3, Leviticus chapter 3 is the Zivach Shamim, Shlamim sacrifice, which is a peace offering. We begin with a footnote from our Hebrew scholar, Nehemiah Gordon. Here's an interesting thing about the peace offerings in Leviticus 3. You won't find anywhere else the description for the word atonement. So the specific sacrifice brought here were not atonement sacrifices. There is no atonement involved in bringing the peace offering or a thanks offering. Joan Ovandor says, so it's called a peace offering. Is it as if they don't have peace between them and God? What is that about? Nehemiah responds, so a peace offering is a sacrifice that you bring as a way of showing your thanks, your gratefulness to God. It's a way of showing that you're in a state of peace and you're bringing that to God. The difference between the peace offering and the burnt offering, in a sense, is that you actually eat. The person who brings it eats the peace offering. Verse 1, and if his oblation be a sacrifice of peace offering, if he offer it of the herd, whether it be male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. So this time, we learned something. You can offer male or female, but again, they both always need to be without a lamb without blemish, or from the herd, a goat, a lamb, or whatever, without blemish, and in this case, male or female. Halverson says, he just basically repeats what I'm talking about. Finally, we see offerings can be from both female sheep and goats and so on, and not just from male. Now, the burnt offering, since that's most indicative of the atonement of Jesus Christ, yes, it must be a male without blemish. But in terms of peace and reconciliation, of course, the female offering would be just as relevant and powerful and effective as any male offering. Then he adds, it's been my experience that the people that do the better job of relationships and of community gatherings often tend to be the sisters. So to see that as the renewal of relationship, the feeling of fellowship, there seems to be something fitting in both male and female contributions here. Now, part of it's going to be for the Lord, the fat, the kidney, and the liver. The liver delivers, that's just one. Those would go to God. We saw that back in Exodus, he says. And you'll notice as I scroll here how many times I highlighted the divine name that has been restored. We've gotten past the King James Version of the Bible, back to the original Hebrew, where it always used the name of God the Father. Over 6,000 times in the Old Testament. Quite remarkable that I wouldn't be aware of such a thing until late in life. Nehemiah Gordon adds after verse 11, he doesn't eat the whole burnt offering. It's obviously completely burnt. Joan Ovandor, I was going to ask you about this because it says in verse 11, and the priest shall burn them on the altar as food, as an offering made by fire to Yehovah. And obviously, Yehovah is not eating the offering, so it says as food, which we understand that they themselves partake of what becomes a meal. Nehemiah says, so first of all, it says lechem, which is bread. It literally says, and the priest shall burn it. Actually, it's not talking about the meat. I mean, if you're talking about the peace offering, there were parts of the peace offering they did eat. But in verse 11 here, it's specifically talking about what's described in verse 9, which is the fat, the forbidden fat. There are actually 6 types of forbidden fat with the sheep and 5 for the goats and the bull, and those aren't burnt on the altar. That's what's called the lechem aish li, or esh, the start over. Lechem aish le Yehovah, a bread, a fire offering to Yehovah. In other words, in some kind of symbolic sense, this is the bread of Yehovah. Does Jehovah actually eat it? I don't believe so, but I'm sure somebody out there would argue that he does. Nehemiah is often in serious conversations with believers from so many different backgrounds. It's amazing, uh, the differences. Let's just continue. Jono says, so we're back to the question, does he actually smell it or does he actually eat it? Nehemiah says, right. So does he smell it? Does he eat it? Does he taste it? I don't think it's a literal sense, in the literal sense, but it's being described in those symbolic terms. And Jared Halverson adds, our LDS scholar says, now one last caution, though, he says in verse 17. So let's scroll to 17. Just before that, Jonah Vandor says in verse 16, it absolutely specifies all fat belongs to Yehovah. Verse 17, it shall be a perpetual statute for your generations through all your dwellings that ye eat neither fat nor blood. Wow. Now, specifically, this is the fat that's attached to those internal organs that are being given to God. There's different kinds of fats here. To have absolutely no fat in your diet is not only unhealthy, it is impossible, says our LDS scholar, Jared Halverson. So it's a specific kind here. But these things, this fat and all blood belongs to the Lord. But it's all capitals. It belongs to Yehovah, is Papa John's insert there. And Jared finishes his footnote by saying, and yes, there's some temporal, some physical value here as far as health is concerned. What you're consuming and what you're not. We're going to see more of that later in Leviticus, but also the spiritual. Don't keep for yourself what's intended for God, even if you don't know all the specific reasons why. Why not that fat and why not this blood in general? Just trust God. That's what he's asking for certain things. The tenth is mine and the handful belongs to me. Be grateful for the greater portion that I'm allowing you to fully live into. But this or these will be sacred. Now, our Hebrew scholar is going to help us out with verse 17. It talks about here how you can't eat the fat in any animal. In any of these types of animals that you've sacrificed, you can't eat the fat. That's an internal statute throughout your generations in all your habitations. And they translate that word as fat, but that's not really accurate. The word is havel, which is a specific type of fat. There are 6 specific types of fat. Havel and all blood you shall not eat. The types of fat are actually listed back in verse 9. There is the fat tail, the clump of fat of the tail of the sheep. There's the fat that covers the innards, and there's the fat that's on the innards. And that's what generally in English we call suet. Uh, there are the 2 kidneys and the fat upon them, and there is the appendage on the liver, which is the fat that covers the liver. So it's 6 types of fat. Again, it's not like the fat in your marbled steak. That's actually a specific type of fat that, like I said in English, I think that's usually called suet. They use it for pastries and things like that. You are forbidden from eating that according to the Torah. Not because it's unclean, but because it's holy and belongs to Yehovah. Therefore, you must leave it. For a lot of our carnivore friends in Christianity who love to barbecue, that's a tough one to swallow. No pun intended. Now, our Methodist minister says, so the burnt offerings would be considered for what, Nehemiah? Nehemiah responds, so the burnt offering is a free will offering, although there are specific instances where one is required to bring, generally, where the priest is required to bring a whole burnt offering, and then at various festivals and things like that. But as the rule, the individual would only bring it as a free will offering. Keith Johnson responds, second, in the grain offering, what do you think? What do you see the grain offerings as being for? And Nehemiah says, so the grain offerings, again, is a free will offering. There are specific instances where one is required to bring a grain offering. It actually talks about that as a first fruit offerings, which is a specific type of grain offering. But by and large, this category, grain offerings, is a free will offering in specific instances where you are commanded to bring it. There are instances like that. But as a rule, this is a free will offering that you bring because you feel like you offer something to Yehovah. So it's not actually something that you're required to do. And here we are at the end of second episode, well, the chapters 2 and 3 of Leviticus. And regarding the free will offering that you freely offer, I really like that. When I partake of the sacrament on Sundays at church, to be honest, Papa John wasted probably most of my life sitting there in a self-loathing mindset, feeling like I never could get it right. And here I am another Sunday later, a full week, and I still haven't overcome my sins and temptations and some addictions. And it was just like uh, I was not participating in the purpose of the sacrament in the right way. And it took me years to realize that I needed to offer not my worst, but my best. What are my strengths? What are the good things I can offer God? And my wife and I, Shauna Lee and I, discovered that that changed our whole experience in the sacrament of thinking of what talent do I have? Is there something I can do for somebody? And Lord, as I ponder upon the emblems of the symbolism of your flesh and your blood during the sacrament, you know what? To show you my faith and commitment to you, these are some good things I can offer. And I think that mindset alone helped me stop focusing on my dark side or my weaknesses, and I started to begin focusing on my strength. I hope that helps someone out there. But we've already finished this episode, so let's wrap it up. Think about these things. I'm grateful for the scholars from their different worldviews, their different backgrounds. The LDS scholar Jared Halverson, Nehemiah Gordon with the Hebrew, Jono from Australia, and the Messianic believer as Christ as his Messiah, and our Methodist minister, Keith Johnson. I think this is a well-rounded conversation, and I'm glad that we can eavesdrop and listen in. It's definitely changed my life. Think about these things, ponder on them, and I'll talk to you guys again soon.